So good day, everyone, and welcome to another session of Full Disclosure, where we speak with people working around transparency, accountability, and civic participation. Today, we have Ivana Fertziger, senior program officer with Ford Foundation. Ivana, we are happy to meet you today. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us more about yourself and what you do at the Ford Foundation?
Sure. Um, so, as you said, my name is Ivana Fertziger. I've been with the Ford Foundation now for just over 7 years. And I work on our natural resources and climate change program strategy,
Mhm.
which is focused around securing and protecting the rights of Indigenous, rural, Afro-descendant, and traditional peoples to their territories, which includes their land, but also their cultural heritage and their spiritual sites and their access to water and uh, clean air and other natural resources.
Yeah. So what motivated you to start working around this issue of transparency and accountability and civic participation?
So, to be clear, my work isn't strictly about transparency, civic participation, and accountability.
Mhm.
It's certainly an important part of our work, but it's not my area of expertise. And I think, in the natural resources and climate change space, we recognize the importance of transparency and accountability, particularly around large-scale mega projects, extractives projects that affect Indigenous, rural, and traditional peoples' territories. And then civic participation is key so that we ensure that local communities participate in the decisions that affect them vis-a-vis these extractives projects, mega projects, infrastructure, and public policies more broadly. So I think we recognize that there are some important challenges for local communities in terms of understanding, knowing what are the projects that are intended for their territories, who are the corporations behind them, what's their track record in other parts of the world, and um, how to make sure that they have access to this information, that they can analyze the information and understand how it how these projects are going to impact them and their territories and their people. Um, and then for them to be able to make decisions about where they stand on these projects and how to ensure that their rights and their visions are also taken into consideration. So it's an important piece, but it's not the end goal. It's a tool for them to assert their rights and their visions.
Okay, that's good. At least you might not be working directly, but it's reflecting in the work you do, which is very, very important as well. So I will ask that in your personally, how has your personal experience and your previous professional experience before joining Ford Foundation, how has it influenced the kind of work you do now?
Um, I think it's the field of transparency and accountability. And again, nor in my current role nor in my previous roles has that been my priority sort of focus area or area of expertise, but I think it's always been there as an important resource and an important tool and a really highly relevant field for our work. So um, I think when it's about asserting the rights of peoples, Indigenous peoples, rural communities, local communities, and other historically or traditionally excluded peoples, it's a really important tool because the at the core of what we're trying to do, particularly for example now in the natural resources and climate change work, is to address the inequalities that exist around the costs and benefits of natural resources management and extraction. And you can't do that without information. You can't do that without transparency. Um, and there are a lot of decisions that are often made behind the scenes between public policy actors and corporate actors that without access to that information for local communities, they don't know what they're grappling with. They don't know when they're grappling with it. They don't know what the impacts are. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I think it really comes down to this issue. How do we get the information available to them so that they can analyze it and make decisions and participate in those sort of the decisions that are made around those mega projects, whether it's if they happen, how they happen, when they happen, sort of all of those issues. So it's and they can't hold those actors accountable for what they said they were going to do. So I think it's a key part of the equation, and it's not one that's always readily available. This information is not always public. In fact, it's often maintained quite opaque, intentionally.
Great. So, Ivana, I read a little bit about you before this interview, and I realized that you've worked around issues of promoting financial inclusion in marginalized households. And my question to you is, what significant changes have you seen in this area, especially when it comes to grant making around this area of financial inclusion and reducing poverty?
So it's true, I started my work at Ford working around poverty reduction, and shifted along the way because of institutional decisions. But so I don't know today how philanthropy is working so much around financial inclusion. I can't say for sure because I'm not part of that world. I do believe that in my previous experience was very much focused around ensuring that that particularly rural communities and marginalized communities had access to financial services that met their needs. And a lot of, in the early days, a lot of foundation work was focused on setting up those institutions so that they actually would exist. And in sort of the era of microfinance, and when it was really getting off the ground in the 90s and early 2000s, that was really important work. And then it sort of evolved more away from actually just establishing those institutions, and then really making sure that they were meeting the needs of their communities, because they established a certain set of very simple financial services, but those services were not necessarily adapted to the needs of all people. So I think that that was where my work was focused. And to make sure that it's similar to the issue of transparency and accountability, in that they're important tools. They're the means to an end, but they're not the end objective. Financial services are important because of the opportunities that they open up for people to access credit and have savings services, make it possible for people to safely save up for to meet their personal or professional objectives, or to access credit that allows them to get a business up and running and generate revenue to take care of their families and to pay back those loans, right? So they're important. They're the means to an end, but they're not the end goal. And I think the same is true for transparency and accountability. They're really important tools that should be sort of part of the basic toolkit for all people. And they're important for achieving their objectives, whether they're individual objectives or collective community objectives. And I think it's important to think of those and think of both financial services and transparency and accountability in those terms. Is how do we make those tools accessible, but recognize that that's not the end goal. It doesn't stop with getting the information out there in accurate and accessible ways. It's how to make sure that people can use that information or use those tools to meet their individual or collective objectives.
Okay. Thanks, Ivana. So you work now in the extractive sector, am I right? More on extractive projects.
I work more on sort of the side of community rights to their land, to their forests, to their territories. So often there are issues of socio-environmental conflict because of extractives projects, but I don't work on the extractive sector per se.
Okay. So in that area where you work, what kind of changes would you like to see, let's say in the next 5 years, in the next few years?
Ooh, big changes. I would really like to see the extractives firms and also infrastructure firms and other sources of these large scale projects that are slated for rural territories. And these are territories, by the way, that, you know, for many years were sort of left to their own devices. These are communities that were left to their own devices. And it isn't until, you know, sort of recent decades that that companies and governments started to see real economic opportunities in these areas. And as a result, really started pursuing whether it's extractives projects or tourism or large scale infrastructure for these territories. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon for a lot of people. And like I said, I think one of the real challenges is that they're not held to high standards of transparency and accountability. So basic sort of number one, ensure that companies and governments that have plans for large-scale projects that affect local territories are transparent about those plans, transparent around the impacts of them, doing really good analysis of what those impacts are. And there's a key piece of that, in that governments hold companies accountable for analyzing those impacts in rigorous ways, whether they're environmental impacts or social impacts. And that governments also be held accountable, because sometimes these projects are government-led projects. So I think that's a really important piece of it, that they do, that, you know, the process of doing these impact assessments is not just a procedural thing. It's actually something that's really taken seriously. And that as those impacts are being assessed, that local communities be involved in the process of understanding and analyzing what those impacts are. So they're not just seen from the perspective of the company or the government, but also the communities themselves. That communities be consulted in the process along the way, that they be considered stakeholders in the process. And as stakeholders, if it's not in their best interest, and they determine that these projects are not in their best interest, that perspective also be respected and taken into consideration. And if they do determine that it is in their best interest, that those projects be pursued in ways where the costs and the benefits are distributed equitably between local communities and other stakeholders, whether they're public or private actors or both. And so it sounds like sort of common sense, right? But the reality is that this is not how things are happening. Communities are often the last to find out. And you know, they may not know about the project until the heavy machinery comes into their communities. Or in some cases, until they start realizing that there's contamination that's affecting them because of some project that's nearby. So there's a lot of work to be done in this space.
Yeah, thank you. So Ivana, this time I want you to give a recommendation for people, because you sound so passionate about the work you do. So what recommendation will you give your younger self starting out in this as a program officer, or to anyone who is starting his or her career as a program officer in the development sector?
Wow, lots of advice to my younger self. Um, I think one very overarching critical issue that I would want to discuss with myself and my peers early on is how to ensure that this work be done from an anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal perspective, because the reality is that it's very hard to get away from this idea that the solutions come from the global north or from the urban poles, and then are sort of deployed to local communities in the global South and rural areas. And I think that as philanthropists, we've also been part of that problem. And certainly development professionals, we've also often been part of that problem. And so I want to have a long, hard conversation about what that means and what are the implications of that and how we can move away from it, how we can move away from sort of thinking that we have the answers, and really recognizing that local communities know what they need. They know what they're grappling with. They understand where they come from and where they want to go, and that it's our job to support them in that process. Um, and I think we still have a big debt to pay as the development sector in that regard.
Right. So finally, Ivana, who or what will you say inspire you most and why?
I think today my largest inspiration, I mean, aside from my family, of course, and my kids, my husband, who are a constant source of inspiration and motivation for me, I really would say it's the Indigenous leaders that I've had the privilege of meeting along the way, and the way that they have welcomed me into their communities and into their hearts, and shared with me in the most poignant, honest, open way what they're dealing with and what they're thinking and what their struggles are and where they want to go. And so when you ask me, and professionally who inspires me, I see their faces. I remember those conversations and those experiences of being with them in their communities and walking around and seeing the communities through their eyes and seeing the children and the kind of futures that they want to ensure for their children and future generations through their eyes. That inspires me. And that is a constant source of motivation. And I would say sort of in the professional sort of transition that you highlighted in my career, and even at my time at Ford, that has been I think just one of the most incredible outcomes for me personally is that I've been able to see that and experience that and have that opportunity. Um, and I hope I have many more of those opportunities and I get to meet those people, not just in Mexico and Central America, but in many other parts of the world.
I really hope so too.
Thank you.
And on that note, we conclude this interview. Thank you so much for joining us, Ivana, and thank you for
Uh,
sharing your experience and lessons and everything with us.
Thank you so much, Buseyomi. It's been a pleasure.